This GBVIMS video short is an overview of the definition, types, and process for informed consent. Let's start with looking at consent. What is consent? Some words that may come to mind are decision, agreement, choice of a voluntary nature. Simply put, it's when a person makes a choice to agree freely and voluntarily to do something. We also have to keep in mind that there can be no consent when agreement is obtained through use of threats, coercion, fraud, manipulation, threat to withhold a benefit, or promise to provide a benefit. So what makes consent, the choice to agree freely and voluntarily to do something, informed? We first need to frame it as a two-way process, an exchange of information, a discussion. This goes far beyond providing a document for signature. It involves much more: explaining, inviting, and allowing space for questions and answers. And two core components must be present: voluntariness and comprehension. The latter part, comprehension, is often the one that's assumed and shouldn't be. Comprehension is where the process, the exchange of information, comes in, the assessment of risks and benefits. Let's begin by talking about why we need informed consent. Why is it so important? Consent is critical to our work. It demonstrates respect for the survivor, shows our intention to make the case management process an empowering one, and demonstrates that the survivor is leading the process and we are accountable to her. If consent is skipped and completed improperly, it undermines the principles of the survivor-centered approach and can put at risk our relationship with that individual survivor and with the broader community. We need to keep the survivor-centered approach at the forefront at all times. The rights of the survivor to control their incident data must remain a priority even when it seems there's little risk involved. Even if data doesn't include the survivor's name, it is the survivor's decision if the information will be shared or not. Keeping this approach in mind, let's talk next about the types of consent and then the process. There are three types of consent we'll discuss: consent for services, consent for information sharing for needed and available referrals, and consent for information sharing for reporting, advocacy, or program improvement. The first one, consent for services, is about getting the survivor's informed consent to provide case management services. This is often captured verbally and includes a discussion about the case management process, confidentiality and its limitations, survivors' rights, and space for questions and clarifications. The next two types concern information sharing. First, consent for needed and available referrals. This includes a request to share identifiable information, for example, a name or contact information, to facilitate a referral to another service provider. Second, consent for sharing numbers for reporting, advocacy, or program improvement. This includes a request to share aggregate, or we can say grouped or combined numbers for statistics. These numbers cannot be traced back to the individual survivor. So where does informed consent fit into the case management steps? Although there should be consistent checking in with the survivor throughout the process, the three initial types of consent we'll discuss now fall under the first step: welcome and introduction. The process we're going to discuss now is broken into steps for the purpose of this video short, but in reality, it's much more fluid. A note for viewers as we progress: for the next number of slides, you may want to pause and read through the sample scripts at your leisure. In this first step, following introductions, you're beginning to build a relationship with the survivor and communicate in a warm, open, and reassuring manner. Next, you're introducing the survivor to the case management process. You're reassuring the survivor about her control of the process, and as always, allowing space for questions or clarifications. Then we move on to discussing confidentiality. We want to focus here on using simple language. For example, telling the survivor this means I will not tell anyone what you tell me or share any information about your case unless you ask me to. Then it's critical we introduce the limitations to confidentiality. We do not want the survivor to disclose violence and then tell her afterward that we have to break her confidentiality because of mandatory reporting. Here, we preemptively let the survivor know about the limitations to confidentiality. For example, if she's going to harm herself or others, then we may have to tell a supervisor. It's important that we frame this discussion around protection. The exceptions to confidentiality are in place to ensure her safety and the safety of others around her. Next, we want to ensure the survivor is empowered with information by elaborating on her rights. This includes it being her choice to share information as she wishes. We won't push her to answer questions she doesn't want to. She can go at her own pace. We can slow down, take a break. She can switch caseworkers, or she can stop coming altogether. Remember, she's the driver. Next, we want to introduce the idea of referrals and the possibility of sharing information with other providers if a referral is needed after the assessment process. We're reassuring the survivor that if a referral is needed, we can talk about what information she'd like us to share. The last step before we go into the assessment is asking for consent for services. This is very simply asking for permission to continue the conversation and start our work together. Then you would go into the assessment portion of your session, which we'll skip over for the purpose of this video short. As you end your assessment, then with the survivor, you'll begin wrapping up your session. You'll restate any referrals you agreed to together that she would like outside of your service to be clear on the intended outcome. You'll also discuss what information she is comfortable sharing to facilitate the referral, and you can document her wishes on the first part of the consent form. Finally, as the last step is talking with the survivor about information sharing for reporting, advocacy, or program improvement. Because this part of the consent process can be difficult to understand, let's read through some sample scripts together. You could say to the survivor, as part of our work, particularly for making changes to improve services for women and girls, it's valuable and important for us to keep track of information about violence being reported to us. Some of the ways this information may help us could be to increase the number of caseworkers like me if there is a need. No information we collect will be specific to you or the violence you report. There will be no way for anyone to identify you based on the information that's shared because it will be grouped together with all of the other reports we've received. It does not include any names or specific information about you. Do you have any questions about this based on what we've previously discussed? Are you okay if we use this information to improve services or for reporting? You can also change your mind later if you decide. No matter her response, yes or no, we can then document her choice on the consent form. A few points to wrap up for clarification. First, you know the process for informed consent, but how does consent get documented? For consent for services, this might be a checkbox on your case management forms or received verbally. For the two other types of consent that relate to information sharing, they get documented on the consent form. This consent form must be stored separately from the intake form. Another clarification. When we reference non-identifying data, we're talking about data that cannot be linked back to the individual. Things that might identify someone could be the name, registration number, ration card ID, or contact information. That's all for now. Thank you for watching this GBVIMS video short.